But I've realized it's the inner work that often leads to outer success in the business. Where I feel like I want to dedicate my life is to help people achieve their personal freedom so they can bring their greatest gifts to the world.
Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to the Deal Maker Show. So today we have a founder, that is quite an amazing founder. I mean, I'm actually, a big fan, and also I was a customer, of theirs. I mean, I bought, their drink every day, all day. I remember especially after a night out, it came in handy. And I think that his story is super inspiring. I think we're all going to learn a lot. I'm really excited about this. And again, building, scaling, financing, exiting, also rebuying again, like the previous company. I mean, brace yourself for quite the episode. But without further ado, let's welcome our guest today, Mark Rampolla. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alejandro. I'm happy to be here. I'm a fan of yours as well in the show, so it's great to be here. I'm honored.
So originally born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Give us a walk through memory lane. How was life growing up for you?
Oh boy, life was simple and easy in Pittsburgh in that era. I was a big sports fan then. Everybody was fanatical. My family didn't have any money. We weren't poor, but nobody in the neighborhood had any money. So it was just a great place to grow up. I could be outside all day, go play for hours at a time, and I loved growing up that way. Youngest of six kids. It was a good time and place.
So how does this whole idea of entrepreneurship, do you think for you it developed over time, or you had people in the family, you were born with it? What does this whole thing come from?
Maybe I was born with it, but I wasn't raised with it. Not only entrepreneurship, but business. There was no one in my family that was in business at all. And even in my neighborhood, I remember I've thought back on this, the only true business person I can remember that was any family friend was a guy who was the Maxwell House Coffee, if you remember that brand, salesperson for Southwestern Pennsylvania. That was it. But I do remember he had just a little bit nicer house, just a little bit nicer car. He was kind of a salesy type guy. And that planted a little bit of a seed, but it really wasn't until I went to college and met friends that, grew up in business families or had an interest in business that I began to even take an interest. And even then, entrepreneurship seemed weird to me. This is the 90s, and it just was not I felt like to change the world or have an impact or make money, the place to be was corporations. And that's what I went after.
Well, I mean, corporate tech sounds like it was your thing in the 90s. So I guess how was that journey like for you, and what was your big takeaway?
It's been a circuitous journey in many ways. So I wound up getting an internship with IBM during college, suit and tie days, basically teaching Lotus 1-2-3 for those that are older than a certain age, the precursor to Excel, to their customers. And interesting, also, I was helping little tech companies from this weird place called Silicon Valley integrate and sell their software to IBM customers in Wisconsin, right? But it didn't click for me that there was this whole tech revolution. And I was not a suit and tie guy. So I quit that to join the Peace Corps and became a Peace Corps volunteer in Central America.
That's amazing. I mean, how did you get that calling? All of a sudden, like switching and finding yourself in Latin America. I mean, that's quite the shift.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's when I look back on that, I think in many ways that was more characteristic of my family. Although no one traveled, my parents were activists, very Catholic, but an activist Catholic. Like Jesus was a radical. We go out and we serve the poor. We help. And so that was planted in my mind. I did go to a Jesuit college, and there's some aspect of social service there. And so I think that resonated, but also I think I had an adventurous spirit. I know I had an adventurous spirit. And that was, I remember going down a career fair with all these little booths back in that day. And I was interviewing for some corporate jobs, and I wasn't exactly getting a crazy positive response. My grades weren't great. My test scores weren't great. I think I could look back now and see I really had ADHD pretty seriously. But then I saw this little teeny booth with a little table with a Peace Corps stand, and that resonated with me as much for the adventure as anything. Get out of the country, start to explore. I'd never been out of the country, didn't speak any languages, and this just sounded like something fun and adventurous.
So obviously, for you being able to see, more of the world outside of the U.S., I'm sure that that gave you quite a bit of perspective because, especially when you're in Latin America, it's not as comfortable as being in the U.S. So I guess, what do you think that opened up for you in terms of perspective?
Oh, it changed my life, Alejandro. You're absolutely right. It opened up the world to me, and it helped me see one of the things, a couple of things I saw. One was I had all these projections and imaginations and stories I told myself of what, living in a place like that and frankly, how quote unquote poor people might live. What I found was, man, they were happy living their lives, had same dreams and hopes as anybody else. I also quickly had, didn't grow up like I mentioned with any real money, but I made $187 a month. Now living in this was Costa Rica pre-zip line and Four Seasons. That was enough to live comfortably. I rented a teeny little house. My daughter saw it some years later and said it was a shack. It was. But I was fine. And so I had a great time. And so I didn't build any association of money and happiness. It was like I can get by on that. I also saw early indications of sort of sustainability work. And I loved seeing early, I did meet a lot of entrepreneurs. I met family businesses. So that laid a foundation for me in many ways. And I'll tell you one thing I remember that years later would come back. I remember hiking into some of the most remote villages across Central America. After the Peace Corps, I backpacked across Central America for 3 months. You could get a place where it's mud roads. You can barely hike there. And what would I see? Coca-Cola. And I do remember even thinking back then, wow, what would it be like to leverage the power of business, the power of that sort of infrastructure to do more than just deliver sugar and water somewhere? And so that seed has sort of stuck with me. It wasn't until years later I thought about the beverage industry or coconut water, but there was some seed around that. And of course, I tasted coconut water there for the first time, right? You're at the beaches, you're running around, did have it as a hangover cure, did have it as a mixer. So it just was part of my life.
So obviously, as they say, ideas, they're dormant. We don't even know that they're there, right? Now, in your case, you ended up coming back. You do your MBA at Duke. But typically when people do their MBAs, they go at it and, they start their first business or they have the business plan, as the final paper, kind of thing. But in your case, you decided to, keep going on the corporate side and take a tour through Asia. So why was that the case?
Yeah, great question. Look, even then, I would say the world has shifted. So even in the late 90s, entrepreneurship was not what it is today. It just wasn't. And so there were a few students in my class that were interested in it, but not a lot. And I'll own I'm influenced by those around me. I also think there was an insecurity in me, and that was in part driven by the fact that I had 100,000 plus in debt knew I would have that coming out of grad school. So I wanted a job. I wanted a paycheck. I was in a relationship. I'd fallen in love. So I started kind of thinking, I need security. I need security. And so I took this opportunity that came up, right? And again, I wasn't top in my class. Back then, I can tell you, interviewing and mentioning that I went to the Peace Corps after IBM, the question I got from interviews were like, why would you do that? And it wasn't like a trick curiosity. They didn't get it, right? And so I found that I was running up against some walls where ironically, this old school, paper and forest products company, International Paper, they had a bunch of little businesses around the world, and they were looking for like 1 or 2 a year MBAs to join them, get trained, and potentially go run them. So they were astute enough to say, my God, a Peace Corps volunteer is the perfect background for that.
So at what point, I mean, obviously at this point, you still had the idea of coconut water from what you had experienced in Latin
Right.
America. But what was that moment that kind of like pushed you to take action and to want to really bring it to life, with
Yeah.
ZICO?
Yeah. It's a great question. So fast forward, I'm living in Latin America with my then wife, Mora. We have two girls, teeny little girls born. And we've been there for 5 years, living in El Salvador of all places. And I'm beginning to think about my career progression. I'm talking to the corporation about where I might go. And I had a little bit of a crisis of confidence, of uncertainty about my life, because for International Paper was based in Memphis, Tennessee. We lived there for a couple of years. We loved it, but that's not where we wanted to be for the long term. And when I looked at my boss's job and my boss's boss's job, I thought, God, I'm not loving those. And then also, as much as they treated me amazingly, I learned a ton. It's paper and packaging. Like I think I was getting a little bored with and not very stimulated by that. And so this actually, what became ZICO started with, in many ways, fear. And the fear was, oh shit, I, I don't see myself on this trajectory. And if I leave, the job I'm trained to do is be a general manager or maybe a president for a division of a US corporation in Latin America, which means I live in Miami and travel 150 days a year. Like, I don't want that job either. So I started to think, what if I started something? What if I started something? And so it was that desire for, frankly, a life that was more free than I thought I'd ever have in a corporation, free to craft my own time, choose where we wanted to live, move on our terms. We were at this point had this sort of proverbial golden handcuffs of an expat. I was getting paid well, companies paying for schooling, housing, cars, right? Like life is good, but companies are good at keeping you trapped that way, right? And so I think that was the beginning of me really wanting to break free. And so it started with that, and then the idea came afterwards.
So then what happened next?
So, I started brainstorming ideas, and I would, just decided, all right, I'm going to find an idea. And so I'd spend weekends just brainstorming everything from rolling up the dairy industry of Central America, right? I didn't really know what a roll up meant. I knew that industry. I was selling to them, as well as a lot of products from Latin America. I looked at clothing, food, chocolate, other things. And so there were a lot of sort of export products. I actually looked at integrating a trucking business that this time, the North America Free Trade Agreement had been signed. They were expanding that to the Central America Free Trade Agreement. There was an expectation that trucking is going to be a big need. So I was considering getting into the trucking business. And then through some conversations, with friends and family and my then wife as well, I started to develop some criteria. Okay, these are all great, but how am I going to know if it's a great idea? And so I developed a list of criteria, some of the typical business ones: big industry, good enough margins, opportunity to disrupt, opportunity to build something endurable. But then there were the personal ones. How would this fit with my lifestyle? Can I get out of bed and just be super energized about this? How will my girls think about this 20 years from now, right? Is it consistent with my lifestyle? And those are the criteria that eliminated trucking, eliminated rolling up the dairy industry, and started to put more of food, beverage. I'd always been active, health conscious. I loved Latin America. I loved the idea of bringing something from Latin America. And coconut water was on the list. How is it on the list? I think you nailed it, Alejandro. I hadn't actually even thought about that. It had been latent in me for a decade. It had been there.
So then how were the early days like? Give us an insider, look on how it was to really, get things going, and the first days and the first sales, and what did that look like?
Well, look, as the master fundraiser, you'll appreciate this. I had never raised money in my life. I had no family network with friends with money. At least that's the story I told myself, right? I'm really think a lot about the stories we tell ourselves. But I raised $1 million from mainly a group of Latin American businessmen that all the businesses I ran in Latin America were joint ventures. So International Paper owned from 51 to 80%. And there were local families that owned the rest. And so I had these families on my board of directors. And they eventually asked me to join their board of directors, local businesses in mainly Central America. And I got to know them really well. And at some point, they approached me together as a group while I was still, at International Paper before I had the idea. And they said, Mark, we know you're going to leave International Paper and start something someday. We want to back you, whatever it is. And it was a year later, but that was a big part of building my confidence in like, wow, maybe I can do this. So I love these guys for that to this day. But at the same time, their approach was Latin American at the time investing, which is basically like you put up the capital, you own the company, right? And I was not in the mindset of Silicon Valley. I wasn't in the US to sort of absorb and think about that. So I gave away a lot of the company for that $1 million, right? But that to me seemed like a fortune. And so I had a business plan. We decided to go to New York. So with $1 million, I quit my job, moved to New York, brought my wife and young girls there, and we were technically bankrupt within 6 months.
Wow.
And so I'll tell you through some of the journey, but basically the next 5 years was raising money every year, little by little by little by little. But we were growing, but it was brutal.
What was that moment that it was the inflection point where you were like, I think we're into something here. I think we're going to be okay.
Boy, there were a number of them along the way. It's hard to say that there was one specific one. I remember people saying, well, you just need to get into Whole Foods, or you just need to get on Oprah, or you just need to get a celebrity or an athlete. Well, we did all those things, and the business was growing, but it took time. And I love talking to you about this. You were seeing this as a consumer. Our adage was make inch wide, mile deep, like own New York City. I got to a place where I would tell my team, New Jersey's international. No, we don't sell internationally. We sell in New York City. And it was, I don't know where you were living at the time, but it was all anchored around Bikram hot yoga studios. So every Bikram hot yoga studio in the city had ZICO, sold a ton of it, post-workout recovery, and then we would build in the neighborhoods around that. So there was a point where I first probably knew that this was legit was when we got approached by Coca-Cola, and this would have been probably 2008, so 4 years after we launched. And they had just paid 4.2 or 4.1 billion for vitamin water. They didn't want to repeat that again. They felt like they had missed out on getting in early. So they formed something called Ventures and Emerging Brands to try to connect with and learn and connect with founders earlier. So around that time, I got approached and met this guy that was a senior executive working in the Ventures and Emerging Brands group. And he said, Mark, you're not going to believe this. We did a nationwide study of trends, not just beverage, fashion, music, culture. ZICO showed up on that map, not coconut water, ZICO. Can you believe that? And I said, yeah. And he said, what do you mean? Like, how would you have expected that? And I said, let me guess. You looked at young, active consumers. Yep. Okay. You targeted New York, LA, Miami, and maybe Boston or something like that. He said, yep. You used places like Whole Foods as trendsetters. You used running, cycling, triathlons, yoga. Yep. And I said, that's our audience. So you're validating that our marketing hypothesis was right. We're reaching the consumers that are the influencers, the same ones you think are the influencers. And the fact that we had cracked that code made me say, okay, we're on to something. We're on to something.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So obviously, having Coca-Cola, I think that's pretty amazing. But I know that also you were working there with Jesse Itzler
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
No, he came right around that time. How is it working with Jesse? Like, I mean, obviously I follow him on Instagram, and he is hilarious. With
He's
his sauna
hilarious.
stuff and everything. So how is it like? Working
Look,
together.
I love Jesse. There's nobody on the planet that thinks like him, and so we had met, and it didn't sort of connect the way early on. It had connected, but I knew he was considering and working behind the scenes on bringing out his own coconut water. And I knew that he had approached Coke around the same time Coke had approached me. And so at some point, the Coke team actually came to me and said, look, Mark, we love you. We love the ZICO brand. You're on your way. You've got the traction. We want to back you. Our worry is, can you create the buzz and excitement that's we're going to need to really see this thing scale? And they said, we've got somebody that's sort of a friend of Coke, a guy we like. We wonder if you'd be willing to meet him and talk about it. And I said, let me guess, it's Jesse Itzler. They're like, well, how do you know that? I'm like, look, I know for sure. So then Jesse and I met and totally hit it off, right? We really spent some time together. And so when he came in as an investor, and he brought in a bunch of celebrities and athletes. And then at the time, he had a boutique little, sort of marketing support team that we had an engagement with as well, and it was fantastic. So he was a great active, investor. He was a board member, and he's not in the weeds of the business. That's not his zone of genius. His zone of genius is thinking about unique ways to get things in the culture, and so that was super helpful. So celebrities, athletes was not my world. Unlocking those things were not my world. And that became a real asset. I mean, in many ways, I wish, had we never sold, I think we might have been able to more fully utilize that capability. But the business was taken off already. I mean, we were already growing by 100% per year. So it was only another 4 years or so, and Coke just jumped at the. Well, actually, I'll tell you that story separately.
But
wound up
why don't we talk about that? Let's talk about Coca-Cola. Saying, "Hey guys, let's get a deal done here." I mean, make us insiders there. Like, how did that
Oh
deal,
boy.
come together?
Oh yeah. Look, I love this story, and I haven't told this one a lot, so you're going to get some insight here. So first of all, so for some context, we have one major competitor at the time, Vita Coco. We're battling it out. I know they were in discussions with Coke too, and Coke chose us. We thought, and I know I've talked to Mike Curbin, the founder there, that's still the co-CEO. We both thought it was game over. Like, they're going to get crushed. ZICO's going to become the dominant brand. It's over, right? Just a matter of execution and all this. Well, we all got that wrong. Coke's an amazing company, right? No disparagement against them at all. Big companies, generally speaking, get really good at one thing and they're bad at everything else. They are not good, particularly at the time, and I don't think they're any better with small brands. It's so small, $50 million business. Like, where does it fit? Oh, it's a water. Let's put it in the water division. Oh, no. It's a juice. Let's put it in the juice division. Like, let's use our distribution network. Let's not use our distribution network. Like, you can't make those, 3 GMs after I had left. You can't make those sort of changes with a small brand. So effectively, even in the early stages before we sold, there was a lot of challenges. And I remember we worked for almost 2 years to gear up to just begin to distribute in 2 markets, LA and Miami. And the business was doing great with no Coke distribution at all, right? We were growing by 100% per year. So it took 2 years of planning to launch just those 2 markets. And when we did, the results were like, not great. And so the Coke team kept saying, you got a brand problem. You got a brand problem. So the brand's not resonating. And I wasn't buying it. So on our dime, we hired some virtual sort of tech-enabled shoppers to go in and scan the store. And the out-of-stock rate was through the roof. Because it turns out that what would happen with the ZICO consumer is they go, nobody buys. Alejandro walks by and buys 6, right? Then nobody buys. The data shows, let's say it's seven in a week, one per day. They think they can stock one per day, and they're good. But the reality is they need to have 30 on the shelf because there's going to be 5 Alejandros that walk by. So it's, without getting into the weeds, their algorithm couldn't handle the disparity in the high velocity and small consumer base. So anyway, once we showed them that, remember the guy that was running that whole division at the time went on to become chairman and CEO of Kellogg, Steve Cahalan. I said, Steve, you're killing me. You're killing me. And he finally looked at the data and said, we get it. And so that gave me the ability to go back to our board, which now had a number of Coke executives on it, and say, look, we're at a place where we spent a ton of money to gear up for this. We're not getting the results. We need more money. But given the structure of the deal, any money we take in is dilutive to me, not to you. And so I had what I called a come to Jesus board meeting, where I basically laid out 3 scenarios. A, I need $20 million of non-dilutive capital invested in the company within 45 days. You write the check, you invest, no dilution, you don't get any more ownership, and you retain your option to buy. 2, we negotiate for you to buy the company now, and we'll figure out the price. 3, I'll buy you out. I'll buy you out. And so whichever one you want to conclude, I'm game for it. Now, how I would have needed, I don't know, 75, 100 million, which I didn't know I would get, but I knew I could get it, or at least wanted to claim that. And so, we went through a long, hard negotiating process, but they eventually decided to buy it.
And what was the price?
It was a little over 200 million. And
That's
so
nice.
It was definitely under where I think we could have been, absolutely under where we would have been had we waited another, not dealt with them and waited another 5+ years. But, for me and for my investors, it felt like, okay, we made it, we achieved it, we've hit the mountain, we're successful, I'm done, I'm free.
And now one thing that is even crazier is that you guys literally bought it, back the brand for 2%, not even of what they pay. And now, it sounds like next year you're going to be hitting the same numbers, at the time of the transaction. Now, obviously, now you've shifted gears. Also, you're on the investment side. You're part of Ground Force Capital, with like over 300 million of assets under management. And I'm sure that tremendous value that you're able to bring to those founders that you partner up with because of the background operational expertise that you have, which I'm sure it makes all the difference. But there's one thing that, since we were talking about the transaction too of ZICO, and now, with that you achieved financial freedom, is the thought, that people have, if I achieve this, then I'll be happy. Or if I achieve that, then my life is going to be beautiful. And you went through this personal transformation that was that inner work that really led you to a whole different perspective that you're now capturing in a book. Why don't you tell us about this?
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate you asking that, Alejandro. So, yeah, I think, when I, at some point after selling, in many ways, I was the poster child, like many of your guests, of success, right? Quit my job, built the business, sold it, made a pile of money, and won. I won, right? I won. But when I, as the years went on, that winning didn't start to look so much like winning. First of all, I shared with you, I became a really active angel investor. And for many years, the story I told was I became an active angel investor, 40 investments, then eventually started a fund, and all positive. We love to tell our great stories, right? Behind the scenes, I look back and I can realize I was very unconscious about how I was investing. I was acting out of fear, desire, ambition, comparison, and not really knowing myself and understanding. You mentioned, things like strengths of an entrepreneur actually clouded my vision as an investor because I had these big blind spots. I see this again and again. A lot of entrepreneurs, the same thing that makes one a great entrepreneur are many of the things that make it very difficult to be a great investor. I wasn't aware of those, and I could see those now. They were a blind spot, and they caused me some real pain and some real dollars. I lost millions of dollars personally as an investor. Looking back, and one could say, oh, this happens, that's normal. But I can also look back and say how much I was driven by this unconscious drives, desires, fears, comparison. And then similarly, I was happily married for over 20 years, and at some point post ZICO, our marriage just was not what we wanted it to be. And my wife and I tried everything, went to therapy, we tried working on it, but I could see in many ways we had buried and denied so much emotional fear and pain for 10 years that it was almost impossible to process through that in a brief period of time. And so had we learned and understood how to communicate better, process better, digest and deal with emotions, I believe we would have been in a different place. But I consciously remember in the early days of ZICO, realizing if I really feel what's going on inside of me, all the fear, all the self-doubt, all the insecurity, I'm not going to make it. And so I consciously buried, denied. It's almost as if I remember meditating and being like, I'm going to cut off my emotions. Like, they're below me. They're below me. I can float above all this. And you know what? It worked until it didn't. 10 years later, stuff started coming up, and I began to realize what you don't process, what you don't digest, what you don't deal with, it comes back. It comes back. And so, I realized, man, I'm carrying a lot of this into my investment career now. Now I have an institutional fund. We actually have 600 million under management. We have a great team. I am working with a lot of founders. I realized I got to do my own inner work. So I spent about 6 years doing therapy, analysis, coaching, read up on neuroscience, history, spirituality, did tons of retreats, and eventually began to slowly but surely break free of a lot of these things that were holding me back. Limiting beliefs, self-doubt, learning to process my emotions. And I began to feel more free than ever. And I started to see even better results in my business. And then even with tough times, I lost my house in the Palisades this past January. And that's something that in the past, like a lot of entrepreneurs, I'm really good at putting on your shoulder, lean into it, and go through it, right? Well, I did that for a lot of years, and it worked until it didn't. So I decided to take a different approach, and I actually felt all the feelings, and I had a ton of sadness, ton of crying, ton of anger, but I learned to process that. And now I'm at a point where, I'm divorced. I live in a very modest house, given I rented a little something after my house built. And I feel more free than I ever have in my life. And so that's what I turned into this book called An Entrepreneur's Guide to Freedom, because I realized I spend most of my time working with entrepreneurs on the personal things, their own insecurities, their doubts, whether it comes up in a board meeting, a team, their own development. A lot of time on the business, but I've realized it's the inner work that often leads to outer success in the business, but also where I feel like I want to dedicate my life is to help people achieve their personal freedom so they can bring their greatest gifts to the world.
I love it. So, Mark, I guess there's probably a lot of people that are super inspired with your story. I'm sure that there's quite some people too that want to, reach out and say hi. What is the best way for them to take a look at what you're up to, on the investment side, or perhaps, what's the best way for them to connect?
Sure. Thank you for asking. Well, LinkedIn's good for me. I'm not super active, but I do get to it sooner or later. So I'm on LinkedIn. I do have a personal website, markrampolla.co, that's just getting up and running. That's focused around this book. So that's a great place. And then Ground Force Capital is the investment firm, and the book goes on sale on Amazon. It's available for pre-order now, but it goes on sale on the 7th of October. And yeah, I'm loving. I'm getting so many amazing stories The most common one is, I get very vulnerable in this book, and I share a lot of inside stuff that I've struggled with. And the most common response I get from entrepreneurs is, oh my God, thank you for sharing that. Me too. We all want to be seen and heard. We all have these struggles, Alejandro, and I'm committed to opening up a space to talk about them and ultimately to deliver even better results, I believe.
I love it. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your contributions to the venture ecosystem, on behalf of all the founders. And also thank you so much for being on the show today. It has been an absolute honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Alejandro. The honor's been mine. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it.